Hello. I was having a very, very interesting conversation with a friend on Facebook this morning, just about crowdfunding, etc. And I mentioned that I have a very strict set of rules that I follow when it comes to how I choose what I'm going to back, and they've served me very, very well over the years. So um, I figured I'd do a short video just to capture those rules and share what I've learned. And hopefully, this might be useful for people who are sort of getting started with crowdfunding, or just want to sort of be a little bit more systematic in how they use their money on crowdfunding. So, first things first. So, some basic bits of wisdom or ground rules that I like to think of when I make the decision to crowdfund, and I also treat this the same as when I pre-order something. Firstly, you have to accept one very, very fundamental reality, and that is crowdfunding and pre-ordering things is a fundamentally stupid way to spend your money. As far as buying stuff goes, you are short circuiting a lot of the things that exist in a market economy that actually ensure that you, as the consumer, are the winner. The things in a market economy that actually benefit you are competition and basically market response. Things that, and again, this is not flawless, but as a general rule, when you're dealing with a product that is bought and sold, people vote with their wallets. And so if the market is rational, and again, this is not always the case, markets often behave very irrationally, but the thinking goes, if a market is rational, good things tend to sell well and continue to be in demand, and poor things very quickly drop off the radar and don't sell very well as well. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to the rule. There are things which people are irrational about, and so will buy regardless of quality. And this can be seen by established franchises. So, for example, EA Sports games will sell well every single year, regardless of quality, because by this point they are an established quality. But that actually has a few other little pieces of wisdom that follow in there as well. But probably the best illustration right now is this was recorded in December 2020, and right now Tesla is the world's largest car manufacturer by market capitalization. Market capitalization is basically a measurement of the total value of all the shares added up. And right now, Tesla's shares added all up together bigger than any other company by a fair margin. Now, in Australia last year, Tesla sold less than 2,000 cars, and since 2014, they've sold about 10,000 cars in Australia total. Now, that is the number of Ford Focuses that were sold in this country last year. And the Ford Focus is far from a market leader in its market segment. Okay, it's actually getting smashed in its market segment. It's a great car. I've got one. I love it. But the leaders are companies like Hyundai and Volkswagen. So, if a Ford Focus, which is not a market leader, is almost selling as many cars in a year that Tesla has sold since 2014, that gives you an indication of exactly how small Tesla's market penetration is. Now, I'm using Australia's market as an example, but that logic can be applied worldwide. So anyway, sometimes markets behave irrationally, and popularity is not a good indicator. But most of the time, it is a reasonably good indicator of the overall quality of something, especially taken over a long time frame. And this is one of the great things about board games is that it's not something you have to absolutely buy the second it comes out. It's something where, if you look at long-term performance, the cream tends to rise to the top. And so pre-ordering in a market like board games, and by pre-ordering in this case I mean crowdfunding, pre-ordering in a market like board games, which tends to behave rationally, is just an irrational thing to do. It's a silly thing to do. And one of the things you have to basically accept is if you're choosing to pre-order, you are behaving irrationally from the beginning. And so you have to start treating it the same way that you would do other irrational uses of money. For example, gambling. And gambling is probably the closest analogy. I'll use terms that are used in gambling to kind of make my points here. Things like looking at form, okay? So that's my second fundamental rule. So having accepted that you are basically you are spending your money in an irrational manner, you then have to start looking at, well, what are the ways that I can reduce my risk? How can I hedge my bets? And so the first thing you have to look at is, well, you are buying something based purely on promises, on hype, on speculation. So treat it as patronage. You are looking at the persons or people, the company or whatever who've made this thing, and you're wanting to basically vote with your wallet and say, I want more of this thing, even if this specific thing doesn't necessarily turn out very good, I would like more of it anyway. So thank you for making this. I will take the punt on it, and if it turns out good, fantastic. If not, at least I've shown my support financially so that maybe the next time you'll get it right. Okay, so having that mentality helps you eventually frame what you would consider successful and not successful. But even using that logic, I would say I've beaten the odds. Okay, one of the biggest things you need to avoid when pre-ordering or crowdfunding is the idea of potential. Okay, one of the first rules in marketing is to sell the sizzle and not the steak, right? And that's all you've got when you are looking at a Kickstarter campaign or a pre-ordering advertising campaign is promises. And one very, very prominent example of this going badly wrong for people this year has been Cyberpunk 2077. Now, in the build-up to that, now you've got a very, very good games company which has an absolute belter of a game, The Witcher 3, making their passion project. This is something that's been many years in development. And they've shown a lot of stuff over the years that reveals that they're actually hitting some milestones in terms of delivering a game that can live up to some of the promises they've made. But in the ramp to the actual release date, you are getting a few little red flags. Things like release dates being pushed back, and more importantly, for the people who've suffered the worst from this, they've been very reticent in showing actual current gen, so PS4 and Xbox One, current gen console footage. They've only shown footage of the game running on a high-end PC. And so when the game actually hit release, much to their horror, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One owners discovered that the game really struggles on that hardware. Now, if you happen to be lucky enough to play the game on a high-end PC, the game runs nearly flawlessly. So I've got a 3080, I've got a 5800X, so my PC is about as good as you can get without spending small car money on a PC. And the game runs very smoothly, very consistently, but still has quite a few bugs. But the difference is the bugs that I get are irritants, not game breaking. So for me, it might just be quest things don't quite resolve, or HUD things get stuck, or very occasionally get little physics glitches and things like that, or lines of dialogue will cut out. And none of them actually crash the game and kick you out. None of them drop the game to a frame rate that is unplayable. And so if you're one of these people suffering through Cyberpunk on a current gen console, you have my deepest sympathy, because it really isn't fit to play at the moment. And you can actually see the difference too when you play Cyberpunk on PS5 versus a PS4 or PS4 Pro. Because the PS5 is more like a high-end PC, it manages to smooth out a lot of the problems, and you end up in that very small glitch territory. So with Cyberpunk, if you were a current gen console buyer and you pre-ordered that game, you were buying the game on potential. You were looking at what was promised for people who have a top spec PC and weren't actually given any concrete evidence of what you were getting for your current gen console. So potential is a very dangerous thing, and this happens all the time with board games, where lots of big promises will be made, lots of beautiful stuff will be shown, but You know, one of the things you want to look for is if they've opened a campaign and the rule book is not available, that might mean that the game exists as a way to sell miniatures, and then the rules are sort of an afterthought. And so that's one of the things I tend to look for is the rule book available at the start of the campaign? Can I go through the rules and see, is this something that's actually been tested? If this is something that's very pie in the sky, be very, very careful, because it probably hasn't been play tested, and that is probably the biggest bugbear for even commercially available games, is a lack of suitable play testing. So potential is a trap. Don't get too caught up on things that you don't have concrete evidence for. There's, you know, one of the things I avoid completely is technology-based crowdfunding, because many of those things are developing text, pie in the sky stuff that doesn't actually exist in a purchasable form, and they're like, oh, we're going to use the money to R&D and da 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 da. Now, yes, the whole original idea for Kickstarter was for small things to make their passion projects and bring them to fruition, but the reality is that generally good ideas can attract capital investment, and you know, really airy-fairy pie in the sky stuff relies completely on pitching to people and, you know, them buying in. It's all promise and no delivery. And there's plenty of examples in the tech world of that. I won't go into it because the video will end up super long. The last fundamental rule. So far, fundamental rules have been, remember that crowdfunding and pre-ordering is a waste of money. It's a stupid way to buy things. Okay, live with that. Be comfortable with that. You should always be looking at it as a form of patronage, that you are backing, either you're wanting to send a market signal, you want more of this, or that you trust the form of the producer who's making it, and you want them to you know, do their thing. Potential without any concrete evidence is a trap. Okay, and the final basic fundamental rule is that the money that you put into this, you need to treat it as a sunk cost. It should not be money that you will miss. Okay, just like money you spend on lottery tickets or the Melbourne Cup or sports betting, that needs to be pure disposable income. Same thing with money that you put on crowdfunding and all that sort of stuff. Even I have had campaigns which have never delivered, or have delivered super late and not on spec. And I'm always thankful that I don't commit huge sums of money to this sort of thing, because, you know, money, you work hard for your money, and you really want to be extracting maximum value from it. Now, I'm not going to say the right way to spend your money, the split between leisure and you know, serious things, but at the end of the day, you should get the benefit from your labor. Okay, you put the time and effort in, and so if you're going to commit money to make someone else's dream come to fruition, it genuinely has to be money that you won't miss. Okay, and so for me, when I show my Kickstarter history, you'll see that there's lots of stuff in there. In the beginning, I start small, and as my you know, as I've been in my profession longer and my income has grown, then I've been able to go a little bit bigger on some of these campaigns. But I never spent money I would miss. Okay, I never bet the farm on these things, because at the end of the day, even if you miss out on the actual Kickstarter campaign, and this is one of the most important truisms, if you miss out on the Kickstarter campaign, in almost every case that's worth a damn, if the thing genuinely is good, it will still be available to buy in some form afterwards. You might end up having to pay a little bit more for it, or you might miss out on some exclusive little gubbins that make, you know, that you can go, wow, I've got the fancy pants edition. But the reality is, if it's something that is worth existing, then Kickstarter will get it across the line and put it into production, but it will stay in production or will get reprinted. Okay, so they're my basic fundamental rules. So that should be enough for people to get off and get started. And so if you want to yeet out of the video now, it's already 15 minutes, so that's enough to get you started. But I don't make short videos, I make long videos. So what I'll go into now is in a little bit more detail. So these are the things that I look for. Here's how I actually vet and decide where I'm going to back. And again, this is not an investment strategy. I treat this as gambling. I treat this as sunk cost. This is money that I've spent that mentally I have written off. Okay. So the first thing I look for, known quantities. Okay. The advantage of the traditional publishing model. So that is a designer takes their game to a publisher, the publisher vets it, maybe makes changes to make it more palatable to the market, play tests it and puts it into production. The advantage of that is that it has to undergo scrutiny. Okay, it's not just you making a bet based on what's on the Kickstarter screen. It's that someone who knows the industry has looked at it and said, yes, this is a viable product, and yes, I can see the market sector appeal. Now, traditional publishing is not perfect. Harry Potter is famously one of those manuscripts that got rejected and rejected and rejected until someone took a punt and published it, and it became a massive franchise. And there are a handful of success stories like that, but keep in the back of your mind, that's kind of like the same thing as when people say, well, Bill Gates was a high school dropout or college dropout, and he's now one of the richest men in the world. That's right, and the reason we talk about it is because it's unusual. Okay, that's the part that stands out, not the fact that everyone who drops out of high school but goes on to become one of the world drops out of college. Sorry, not high school. The reason we talk about it is because most people who drop out of college don't go on to become one of the richest men in the world. Most of them go on and just be people. But Bill Gates did it in a way that allowed him to fail upwards. He became incredibly successful as a result. But his reason for dropping out of college was that he had a tech company that was in its infancy that was looking like it was going to make millions of dollars. And you see this every day. There's plenty of people who start some sort of social media thing and it starts making stupid money and they can quit their jobs. That doesn't mean it's a great opportunity for everyone. It means it has worked in that circumstance. And for the vast majority of us, the 9-to-5 job is still the way you've got to live. And that's what I mean by a known quantity. They're safer bets. And so a known quantity in the Kickstarter world is when you see a game that has already been successful or a designer that has already been successful. So if you see a new edition of a game that has already been in print, so deluxe editions or second editions or reprints, that's gold. Okay, that is your blue chip option. As if a blue chip option exists here. It's already something that's been successful, people have already looked over it, and by getting the second edition or the reprint or the deluxe edition, you are getting the best possible version of that. And the fact that this phenomenon exists is often a real pain in the ass for the people who do go out there and like to be on the cutting edge and try and play the next hottest thing, because they're the ones who basically eat the loss by getting the crappy first edition that, if you're patient, you can scoop in and pick up the much better edition. So, Brass Lancashire is a phenomenal game, and even in its original incarnation with fairly basic art, I absolutely adored it. But I'm really happy that the new Brass Lancashire editions exist, because the new version is beautiful and it has the production quality to match the quality of the gameplay. And so for people coming into the hobby now, that has been an absolute 100% success story. So known quantities tend to be one of those green light signals for me on a Kickstarter. And this is something that exists in the publishing world too. There are a few designers who, doesn't matter what they do, publishers will back them to the hill. Urania Knizia's, Stefan Feld, Vital Lacerda, etc. Every time they come up with a new game design, you'll see that the publisher will put that thing into print. And because there are audiences who will just buy based on the publisher pedigree, on the designer pedigree. So keep an eye out for those. Look for games that are already fantastic that you don't have that are getting their second edition or their reprint or their deluxe edition. This has been a thing that has served me very, very well. So, for example, Crocodile's a thing that, you know, proper crocodile boards cost an absolute fortune, but thanks to market forces, economies of scale, I was able to get the Mayday crocodile board quite cheaply. So, you know, that's one. Rallyman Dirt, I've got the first edition Rallyman, so here I was the canary in the coal mine, and now I'm eating the loss of buying the better edition, but the better edition will be a big improvement. Probably the biggest success story was, let me find it. Okay, it's being slow here. Been a while since I backed this one. Kingdom Death Monster. Kingdom Death Monster was... I didn't back the first edition of it. And for those people who did back the first edition of it, they actually have made out like bandits because they paid very little for a game that has gone on to become a real phenomenon. But looking at how successful that first wave was, getting in on that second wave meant I saved a huge chunk of money, which I was then able to use to buy expansion content. And because of how Kingdom Death run their campaigns, I've been able to buy that expansion content at a fairly hefty discount. So let other people be the icebreakers for you, let them clear the way, and then scoop in and benefit from that. Okay, let other people test the waters for you. The other way you can, the other thing that I look for are games which have a good chance of recovering. So that's where I'm prepared to take a little bit more of a punt. Bloodborne, the board game. Now, Bloodborne is a phenomenal video game. I absolutely love it. It's probably my favorite of the Souls-like games. And when Simon announced they were doing it, my first reaction was actually to stay well away because the Dark Souls board game is a famous flop. But that one was from Steamforged, who have a really bad track record. I haven't backed a single Steamforged game, and that has not been a bad decision. But Bloodborne was through Simon, and the lead designer was the lead designer who did Rum and Bones. So first of all, we had Form. We had a designer who I've seen take video game mechanics, and in this case we're talking the MOBA, and convert it into a good working board game. And Rum and Bones is a fantastic MOBA game if you haven't played it. Really, really fun, beautiful production values, good minis, nice tempo, etc. So he understands video game conversion into board game. And so when I looked at the approach he was taking with Bloodborne, we could see he was directly addressing the criticisms people had of the Dark Souls board game. He acknowledged the fact that the Souls-like genre is not a roll dice to see if I hit genre. It's a calculated risks, learning attack patterns, learning behavior, and you know, using a very calculated and risk-reward approach. So I knew straight away through the language that he was using that at least the designer was approaching with the correct mindset to deliver an authentic experience. But the other thing I looked at is the fact that with Simon, they pack so much stuff into the box, and especially on Kickstarter editions, that it's almost a joke at this point, but every time a Simon Kickstarter lands, you jump onto the secondary market, so Facebook or BGG or whatever, and people are absolutely going haywire, selling on second and third copies they bought. It seems to be common practice that people will back 3 or 4 copies so that they effectively get a free copy through reselling additional copies or even turn a profit. Now, that's not sustainable. Eventually you reach a point that everyone who potentially might buy a Simon game will actually back it. So don't buy things looking to speculate and make a profit. Like, yes, people do hit big on that, but it's a big sunk cost. It's a long time to get that return on the investment, and there's every chance that no one will want the end product. There's a lot of flops out there, and you'll be left taking a big loss. And if you have that kind of money to burn, if you're more than prepared to commit hundreds or thousands of dollars to long-term investments that will pay off, go see a financial planner and they'll give you some genuine advice. But What you can at least be reasonably secure on is that if you back one of these CMON campaigns and you don't like the game, you will at least be able to sell that Kickstarter edition for what you paid for it, including shipping. That I have seen fairly consistently. Okay, the speculators tend to be successful initially and then they tail off. But what you do see in the secondary market is when those games pop back up, so if someone says, I have Blood Rage with all the Kickstarter stuff, they'll usually be able to sell it for at least what they paid for, maybe more. So those really big mini-driven games, I call them FOMO Gold, fear of missing out. Those ones, if you're prepared to not make a profit, but just to recover costs on it, that can be pretty safe. Okay, they've got a decent pedigree there. So there's two brands I specifically identify for this. CMON, because, they absolutely ram a bunch of Kickstarter stretch goals into their stuff. And Awaken Realms, who follow pretty much the exact same model. And so they're the company who've done this War of Mine, Lords of Hellas, Tainted Grail, Ether Fields. The base pledge for those games, you'll usually get about double the content in the Kickstarter. So you can always resell those for pretty much what you paid for them. Another thing that I say, as it uses a general rule, is to avoid passion projects. And this kind of runs counter to how Kickstarter works. And, this is where it served me well, but I know I'm probably running counter to what Kickstarter spiritually should be. This idea that people can take their darling idea and turn it into a viable thing, bring it into life through Kickstarter, it just hasn't borne fruit. That's how it started, okay? But it's not really how it works now, because the dollar figures have gotten too big. Okay, the expectations have gotten too big. If you start a Kickstarter campaign without a good quality prototype and slick videos and endorsements already and a campaign to pump out updates and all that sort of stuff, if you've just gone, I have this idea, here's some handwritten notes, and I want money to develop this idea and bring it into production, those fail. They don't back, right? There's maybe a handful where that has succeeded, and Blood on the Clock Tower is probably the closest I've gotten to one of those. But even then, I didn't back that as a solo back. Okay, I have very little faith in this campaign at this point in the game. But what I did do was find 5 friends who were also willing to put $20 in. So I've spent $20 on this project, and a handful of friends who want to play it with me have spent $20 on the project, and we've taken a punt. And that was because Shut Up and Sit Down did a big hype video for it, and they've said, this is amazing. And so to have a good experience, I'll spend $20 is kind of impulse buy territory. If I'm at JB Hi-Fi and there's a movie that I haven't seen yet and it's $20, I will spend that to see that movie. Okay, it's better than a rental at that point, because if it's great, I keep it, and if it sucks, well, I'll sell it for $2 down to WeBuy. But $20 was the amount of money I'll commit to an untested, unproven passion project. And the illustration I have for that, there's 2 cautionary tales. The first one is this game Feudum. Feudum is a game that clogs up bargain basements, bargain bins, right? It was a game that was super overwrought. It's shipped with a number of expansions, and it's beautiful to look at it. It's got really cool, clever art. That giant mini's hilarious. But when it came time to looking at what people thought of it, they were kind of like, it's okay once you get past the hump of learning the game. And, there are people out there who will advocate for it and defend it. But to me, that sounds like a game that should have been edited. right? One of the big problems with a lot of these passion projects is you've got these designers who have worked and iterated on this idea over years and years and years, and they've bolted on features and bolted on stuff, and you eventually get to this point where there's just so much extra crap that has been pumped into this design, where it actually probably should have been 3 or 4 different games. And Uwe Rosenberg illustrates this concept beautifully, because when he developed A Feast for Odin, he had a bunch of other ideas about how he was going to use the tetrominoes in that game. And instead of trying to jam them all into A Feast for Odin, which is already a very, very full game, okay? A lot of people malign it as being too much. I love it. I think it's brilliant. But it's right there on the borderline. What he did was he took that extra energy and he used it to make other designs. And that's my first criticism of those. This is the game I've been working on for 8 years, and it's the only game I've ever designed. If this doesn't get published, then I'm a failure as a human being. That's a shitty approach to getting a game to market and becoming a published designer, because iteration is much more useful on like getting designs out, having them perform in the market, and then seeing where you go wrong and then going on to the next thing. That's going to make you a better designer than just wargaming it in your head and then putting all your hopes and dreams into this one thing that you push out into the market and die. And for you to, as far as I'm concerned, like, that is that. Like, it has reached the market. It's something that works for a small set of true believers who are invested enough to put the time and energy into it to like the game. But for everyone else, it's the thing that you see in the bargain bins constantly. You go, well, I don't know, maybe. So that's the cautionary tale. On the flip side, I mentioned it before, Kingdom Death Monster was another passion project that was years in the making. Super overwrought, kitchen sink design, and honestly, for that first wave of backers, they put their money up, and not a small amount of money, a fairly hefty chunk of money up. And it took 3 years for them to get their game. And, they were lucky. It turned out to be brilliant. But what that also meant was, because it was good, it generated demand, and all of a sudden there was more than enough interest for a second campaign. And that second campaign was so huge that for a long time, it was one of the biggest crowdfunding campaigns. So and again, this goes back to that first rule, if something is good enough, it will get reprinted, or it will have additional availability. It will find its audience. Now, there is no Feudum second edition, because you can still buy it at retail at a hefty discount. But KDM is constantly out of print. And this is a $400 US game. Okay? Now, if you were lucky enough to back it at Kickstarters, you paid half of that. Okay? Very glad I did. But hand on heart, do I think it's actually worth its retail price? Yeah. It's that good. But again, I didn't pay that up front with no idea what was happening. I was able to see people test it and be the people that eat that loss. I was able to play a working version on Tabletop Simulator before I put $1 on it. And so that was a passion project that turned into an amazing success. But again, the success snowballed it. Okay? By letting others be the canary in the coal mine, that meant I could get the better second edition, deluxe edition reprint. Okay? And so that earlier rule still applies to passion projects too. Because if a passion project does turn out to be amazing, sure, there might have been a little loss that you might have missed out on being that early adopter. Okay, you're probably going to pay a bit more the second time around than the people who paid in the first time. But that money wasn't tied up for 3 years on a pig in a poke that had a 50-50 chance of being shit. So, think of the opportunity cost there. If you tie up say that first edition of Kingdom Death was 150. I can't remember what it was, but say it was 150 3 years before the second printing, the 1.5 edition. Is there nothing else you could have done with that $150 in the 3 years that you'd be happy about, that would have been worth the $50 loss compared to waiting and backing it the second time around. Because that second campaign, I backed it and I had a copy of the game in a year. Okay, compare that to the 3-year wait for the people for that first edition. Okay, it's just, you have to be a little bit ruthless. Let other people eat the loss on that one. Now, a couple of small ones, and then I'm going to wrap this up because we're just nudged into 35 minutes, and I'm almost certain no one's watching at this point. There's a couple of little strategies you can use. First of all, dollar pledges. Okay, almost every major Kickstarter campaign nowadays, you can put $1 in, and then when it's funded, you can then go onto the pledge manager and you can shop a little more calmly and rationally. And by that point, you know what all the stretch goals will be. By that point, all the rule books have been published, any controversies have been dealt with, etc. Kemet was a famous one. The Kemet second edition, when that project launched, there was a number of things that were just awful, and it was as the campaign went on, they finally addressed it. And so for me, who absolutely loves Kemet, and who when I first heard there was going to be a new, better version of Kemet coming out, I was like, fantastic. Saw the campaign and went, no, God, no. But over time, as the bugbears got worked out, eventually I jumped on board. Okay, and $1 pledge is a great way if they have got an early bird bonus or some sort of thing. You can lock in on that, and even if you forget to cancel the pledge, you're only at $1. The other great strategy is group buys. Okay, one of the big problems with these is the shipping containers full of games being shipped all around the world, and so some of the shipping costs can be absolutely gigantic. And so look for opportunities where if you know something, a thing you definitely are prepared to back, go to Board Game Geek, go to your local board and have a look and see, is anyone doing a group pledge? For me, living in the ACT board on Board Game Geek is one of the busiest Australian boards. Okay, if you look in number of posts here, okay, it is the busiest board, and the ACT is the smallest territory in Australia. So most of the traffic is group pledges. Okay, who wants to jump in and back on this? And honestly, it's a fantastic way to save small to medium to big chunks of money. And if you don't have this happening in your area, start talking around your local board game community and see if you can get some momentum going, because it saves a huge amount of money. And so big shout out to my friend Kevin Ho here, who I often refer to as the ACT's leading board game retailer, through the sheer number of pledges that he has, group pledges that he's managed, doing a huge service to everyone in the ACT. So group buys are a fantastic opportunity to save a lot of money. Finally, the last thing, don't be so invested in a campaign that you are not prepared to walk away from it. There are bad campaigns. There are campaigns where the shipping is just unreasonable. There are campaigns where you might think I love this idea, I desperately want it to happen, but it always struggles to get funding and it goes through a relaunch. One relaunch is my exit. If a campaign has one relaunch, I go, forget it, gone, right? If a campaign has 2 or 3 or 4 relaunches, it doesn't, like, what you've got there is someone lowering their standards to try and to eke it into existence. And, if something's that marginal, you're into territory where this is probably not going to be a good game. So cut your losses. Be prepared to just go, it is just a board game, it is just a video game. Even if this thing somehow squeaks into existence, maybe I should just wait for the retail, if it ends up being good or not. Let other people be the canary in the coal mine. So, in summary, the main thing I would say about pledge, crowdfunding, pre-ordering, Kickstarter, all that sort of stuff, the best way to buy stuff is to wait for it to come out at retail through traditional publishing, and that you've got reviews you can watch, or you can test another person's copy. Okay, that's the gold standard for shopping, and Kickstarter and pre-ordering are both designed to short circuit all of those things and get you to impulse buy. And that's fine if you do want to impulse buy, but impulse buy with money you're not going to miss. And don't be stupid. There are big red flags you can avoid that will increase your strike rate. Okay. Now, even following those rules, there are Kickstarter games that I've played once or twice and they've gone on the shelf or I've sold or whatever. But I can hand on heart say I've only ever backed, like I'd say less than 5% of the things I've backed have either failed to come into existence or are just complete shit. And, you know, that's a pretty good return on investment. And it's not an investment at all. It's a complete waste of money. So I hope that was useful. Thank you if you did watch all 40 minutes of this. Please, if there's anything else you'd like to know, any other information, drop me a comment and I'll try and address it. Thank you for watching.